Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're at page 1267, close to the bottom. 1267. Aleph Reish Samach Zayin. Okay. In the context of the Ayin Beis theme of interface, the interface between the divine and existence, between godliness and us, as I've elaborated many times, how distant they are on one hand, but at the same time, God implanted in his very creation, in the entire cosmic order, the Seder Atzilus, all these embedded interfaces that allow us the stepping stones. I always like to visualize it like stepping stones, going step by step by step. Sometimes you can leap a few steps, but generally going in an organized way, which allows it to be internalized, no different than a beginner student trying to understand and ultimately master the most brilliant ideas of his great teacher. And here we're talking about even beyond the great teacher. Or us, part of the art, trying to appreciate the artist and that which is beyond the artist and beyond being an artist and having a full experience. So this is the elaborate system called Torah and Mitzvahs, Avodas Hashem, serving God, which is really a partnership with God. It's not just serving, it's a partnership. It's using the resources and faculties and tools we were given to grow, transcend our own self-interest, our own selfishness, and experiencing transcendent and higher realities and higher states of consciousness than we began with. And that's an endless process, in truth. And we are literally in the middle of the discussing of this on so many different levels. But the place we are right now, after the whole Volume 1 and Volume 2, which I've summarized every few weeks. I do a summary of the whole thing. I can rely last Sunday or 2 Sundays back, I did a pretty comprehensive one. So it's all recorded. You can always go back to those summaries. But essentially, in the Volume 3, which of course is the last and final volume of Ayin Beis, is the Rebbe Rashab is going into the deepest part of the very abyss, the very darkness of existence, which means like the heart of the darkness, or the heart of the Tzimtzum, or in different words, the Kalim themselves, how they too are going to ultimately be an expression of the divine, not just revealing the revealed levels of the divine. In other words, the Kalim, like the letters, expressing the message of Oyer, the Kalim revealing Oyer, but that the Kalim themselves will reveal not just another level of the divine, but a far deeper level that comes from the Etzem itself, that really is higher than Helam and Gilui. That's why it can manifest in Helam. Because usually you talk about a divine revelation, you need revelation to see revelation. But if you can experience godliness in a place where it's beyond sight and beyond vision and beyond revelation, you're experiencing the essence of the divine. But again, the only way to get there is to first go through the levels that we could see. You can't see the invisible if you don't first see the visible. And the visible allows you to grow, as we've discussed, mutfa, murgesh, muskel. You grow from a childlike, immature state, not just as a child chronologically, but also spiritually, nefesh halikis in its very infancy, from its very behavioral, instinctive, reflexive behavior, as it grows through distinct emotions, and then the mind begins to come into play, first helping guide the emotions, then helping introduce to the emotions higher types of experiences that are beyond our subjective needs and interests, until we go and discover the deepest levels of our love and connection to God at the core level that we call Ava Atzmis, Tainuga Atzmi, the things that connect us. But that comes in the last levels of Yichud, what he called Yichud Abba V'Ima Eloin, or Yichud Abba V'Ima Pnimi, the yichud pnimi of Abba ve'ima, the internal union, where the intellect is not there just to serve and guide the emotions, but the emotions and the intellect are both absorbed. The gay benefits, their very existence is completely absorbed and consumed, and you can't live without godliness. And then he continued and said that how do we actually then shift and how do we experience higher levels of the divine in a lower level when the entire structure of Atzilus is built on a hierarchy? So he introduced Simcha Shal Mitzvah. Simcha shifts everything. Simcha is Peretz Geder. Simcha reveals deeper parts of your own inner self, of also deeper parts in the divine, and also it pierces and breaks through boundaries and ultimately changes the very nature of things. And yet, that works hand in hand together with mitzvah, the mitzvahs, because the mitzvahs are actually what God wants us to do. So simcha shal mitzvah, simcha and mitzvah together, as we learned, are the key to be able to create that shift. And you need both. Simcha reveals it, the mitzvah connects to it. And the simcha reveals it and manifests it in our lives. Yes. And that itself, he spoke different levels. The simcha by most souls, where they can reach a certain level of joy, which is the tachas shel avata b'simcha v'tuv levov, and then the simcha tzadikim ba'avaya, that they can reach a level of simcha that is like completely on the highest level of a simcha that has no motive or objective at all, connected to the ava atzmis and to the tainug atzmi. They spoke about. I'm reading now from page 1266. And la'asad lave will be the full-blown experience of that level of simcha and tainug, where we are completely fused with the divine. And today we have a taste of it, me'ain, similar, a semblance of it in Gan Eden. But then on the bottom of page 1266 and 1267, he asked the next question. So that Adayin yesh lahavin, we still have to understand, where does simcha have this power? The simcha shal mitzvah have the power to cause such a simcha in the highest levels of atzmas, higher than structure altogether. At the end of the day, all mitzvahs are around structure. Evar in the malka, they're God's limbs, so to speak, the king's limbs and organs. And they're kelim, and the neshamas are kelim. And even the simcha is also within kelim. Yes, it expands the kelim and elevates them and breaks through the boundaries, but it's still at the end of the day part of the structure, the highest level of the structure. And here you're saying that it's you're able to reach a place that's completely beyond, like he says, Makeda de Kula. Just use the words he said here. Just want to look where the language is. Where was the language? Makeda de Kula. Yeah. Mitzvah dafka. A mitzvah dafka. You say sef b'makeda de Kula. You reach the highest levels that are completely beyond structure, and you bring that into the structure. And to understand, to answer this, goes now the next level of Ayin Beis as he goes into the paragraph we began reading and learning, which I'm going to sum up now on page 1267, and that is that there's a mila in kelim over eris. That indeed, these very kelim that we're talking about, even though they seem to define structure, they're structure. Kelim means an identity. Oyer is much more a revelation of the source. Kelim is like an identity, yet the sheresh kelim precedes, the root of the kelim precede the root of the eris. And that's why they have a mila also in Atzilus that first comes, you first build the body and then you put the soul into it. Or we call it bin hachemer kodem lebin hatsura. The gili ha'er adei keli dafka. It's the keli, the gili, the revelation of the keli of the oyer is through the keli and according to the keli. It's not like first there's oyer and then you look for kelim. The kelim are placed and the kelim like the letters on a page, and they draw the ideas of oyer through those letters. And the way he spelled it out is like this. The sheirush shemokar of that from which create the kelim is from Atzmus Umuhus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. The kelim of the Natzalim of Atzilus comes from Atzmus Umuhus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. The words of the Rebbe Rashab. I'm looking at the fifth line in the second in the middle paragraph from page 1267. The sheirush shemokar eres on Natzalim, and the root and source of the energies of the emanations is from Ein Sof itself. Bulvad, which is lower than Atzmus Umuhus Ein Sof. What's the difference? What's the difference between the core of Ein Sof and Ein Sof? So he explained that the expression Toyar, the description Ein Sof, is applicable only to Oyer and not to Atzmus. Because Oyer is in the realm, when you say something doesn't have an end, it's suggesting it's in a realm of beginning and end, and yet we're telling you it doesn't have an end. Why? Because the Oyer does have a beginning. So he says, I'll just read some of the key lines. You know what? I'll read the whole thing again. Why not? I'm reading from the sixth line in paragraph 1267, page 1267. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. He says, the Torah Ein Sof Shaykh Lem B'Dover Sheshayich B'Reish V'Seif. The description Ein Sof, no end, is applicable by something that we can. It applies rather by something where it's applicable to say Reish V'Seif, beginning and end. B'Zeh Shaykh Lem She'en Le'Seif. So then you say it has no end. That means something that has a beginning and therefore it also has on its own, it would have an end because everything has a beginning, has an end. Everything has a beginning, has an end. It means it's in that realm, in that domain of beginning and end. Then comes the Chiddush. You say no. Even though it's shaykh to have an end because it has a beginning, it doesn't have an end, though it has a beginning. And he brings from Pelacharim and Koshkosav Pelacharim the Kol Kadmen Nitzchi v'Lei Kol Nitzchi Kadmen. Every kadmen, every primordial, everything that has no beginning is eternal, but not everything that's eternal is a kadmen, was always here, because God could choose to create something that should be perpetual. And that's why even though Oyer has a beginning, v'shayir b'reish, and therefore capable, a bit applicable to say that has a top ahead, and nevertheless it doesn't have an end. That's the chiddush. Aval ba'atzmus, but atzmus you can't say that because the ein le'tchila ve'ein le'tichla. He doesn't have a beginning and has no end. The whole thing, those concepts don't apply to him altogether. The ein shayir ba'inyan reish v'seif klal. In him is not shaykh to say a top, a bottom, a beginning, and end at all. So ein shaykh lema b'Ein Sof. So that's why we can't. It's not appropriate to use the word Ein Sof to describe Atzmus. Okay. So now we have the difference in Ein Sof. Still have to get to. There's more to say. So now he goes. We learned this as well. Omnom. Now he's going to qualify in Ein Sof itself of Oyer that there's two levels. Let me explain it and then we'll read it inside. Ein Sof, you could say, okay, since you say it has a beginning, like I mentioned the other day, you could have two things. One has a beginning and has an end. One goes, let's say, begins, they both have the same beginning point, the creator. One goes for 100 years. The other one, the Eibishter gave it power to go infinite. So they both are, the commonality they have is they both have a beginning. One is 100 years or 100 miles, and one is infinite miles, or 100 miles, 1,000 miles, and infinite miles. So if that's the case, that would be called Ein Sof L'Hispashtuse. That means, okay, one thing has power to, let's say, I can throw a stone for 100 feet. You can throw a stone for 500 feet. The Eibishter can throw a stone for infinite amount of feet. So the only difference really is the power that one who's throwing has infinite power, so he can give it infinite power. But in essence, they're all stones, all being thrown by someone, so they all have a cause. That would be called Ein Sof, more or less, I would say Ein Sof will call it Ein Sof by extension, but not Ein Sof fundamentally. But in Ein Sof itself is going to explain there's a level of Ein Sof that's not just by extension, but its whole personality is an infinite one. In other words, even though it has a beginning, it's all its properties, even at the beginning, all behave in an infinite type of way. So it's not just chesed going infinite, chachma going infinite, but it's beyond, it doesn't even have chesed in it. The whole entity is an Ein Sof, qualitatively Ein Sof. In a way, the difference between quantitative Ein Sof infinite, or is quantitative infinity or qualitative infinity. So he's going to say this is going to be the difference between Atzilus, the Proteus, and Atzilus, the Klolus. So Ein Sof is going to explain is the latter. It's a qualitative Ein Sof. And Atzilus, the microcosm of Atzilus, and Ein Sof is Atzilus, the Klolus, is macrocosm of Atzilus. And the microcosm of Atzilus, the one that Atzilus we speak about in the worlds, is going to be a quantitative Ein Sof, meaning it's Ein Sof. Bria is not even quantitative Ein Sof. Their chesed has a limit. It stops somewhere. So now he's going to explain that. And that's still all not Atzmus, which is beyond even the higher level of Ein Sof, because it's not even qualitative Ein Sof, because you don't apply the word Ein Sof to something that doesn't have beginning or end altogether. So let's learn this now inside. It's a pretty deep little piece, short piece here, but it's quite fascinating. So he says like this. Omnom Masha Oyer Nikra Ein Sof, that what we just said Oyer is called Ein Sof, not like Atzmus, which you can't use that term. Ein HaKavona Derak Ein Sof Lispashtuse. The intention is not that it just Ein Sof by extension. Lispashtuse means it extends infinitely. It means its entire personality, it's in general a state of infinity. Which means, and this means that also in its beginning, even when we know it has a beginning because it has a source, but even in its beginning, that is in the beginning, which means it has a beginning because it has a source, but it's not, doesn't behave like it has a beginning in the sense, let me just read. In other words, even when the begins its journey from its source, it doesn't behave like it has a beginning. It behaves like an Ein Sof type of entity, because God infused it with Ein Sof power. So it's not just, okay, it flies infinite amount of miles or infinite amount of years, but its very personality is one that does not behave like a Reish and a Seif. That's what he says here. So it does have, conceptually, it has a beginning, meaning it has a source, but it doesn't behave like it has a beginning as if, okay, it starts now, and a second before it wasn't there. As soon as it begins, it's already behaving like in an Ein Sof type of fashion. That's what he says. Now, sometimes expression, it's like, in other words, let me give an example for it. If you had a pole casts a shadow. Now, if the pole is finite, is let's say 10 feet tall, the shadow will be 10 feet. I mean, barring any type of extended shadow due to the angle of the light. But it's going to have a limit. It's not going to go forever. If the pole is infinitely high, the shadow will be infinitely high, infinitely extended. But you're not going to say, even though the shadow cannot exist without the pole, that's why it has a beginning, but its personality is a pure reflection of the pole's Ein Sof, because all it is just reflecting that. So even the beginning of the pole, even though we say beginning, it doesn't really have a beginning technically. It has a beginning as the pole is the beginning, the root, the source of the shadow, but the shadow behaves, literally follows exactly the same pattern as the pole does. In other words, its Ein Sof is not just by its extension, its very entity is reflecting Ein Sof. I don't know if it's a perfect example, to be honest, but it came to mind. Anyway, so again, he says the words are say Ein Sof hainu shegam baschalose sheyesh litchila ein b'chinas reish v'kol ma shenimshach mispashet ein b'chinas sof. One second, I want to just see one thing. Okay. So it behaves in an Ein Sof way, and that's why it's called like that. Okay. There's an expression the Rabbi uses from Torah Er. He says, "Yom shekule orach shegam betchilosehu orach." I think this will help understand this. He says, the day that's Yom shekule orach, a day that's completely long. That's the literal meaning. It means basically an endless day. Says the Alter Rebbe, shegam betchilosehu orach. It's endless, not just at the end of the day, meaning, well, there's no end. Not just at the other end, but also in the beginning, it's also endless. In other words, a person who lives a life, a qualitative life, they talk about Avram Zokan Baba Yom. So the Zohar asks the question, what's the redundancy? It says Avram Zokan. Avram was aged. Baba Yom, he came into his days. What's the addition Baba Yom? And the Zohar answers that he didn't just age chronologically, but Baba Yom every day was full. He fulfilled the purpose of each day. So it wasn't wasted days. So you could have someone lives 100 years old. So he's 100 years old, but he's not Baba Yom. You can't say every day of the 100 years was filled with the purpose that it was there for. In a sense, every moment in time is a life. And if you use it right, you bring the day alive, and forever it will be alive because you used it for the right purpose. You did a mitzvah. You did a kind deed. So even when the day passes, the kindness lives on. If you didn't, God forbid, do anything with that day, so the day passes, so you're a day older, but you don't have that element of releasing a type of infinite energy that a day can release when you use it to the fullest. Avram, Baba Yamim, he came with all his days. Every day was filled with that type of goodness, kindness, mitzvahs, serving God, etc. So yes, of course, Avram was born like every human being was born. So he has a beginning. And then he lived his life in this fullest way. So even his beginning becomes infused with a certain infinity that someone who did not live a life with that type of commitment and service does not have. So even though technically correct, of course it has a beginning, but that endlessness that he infused it with, that infinite energy, is there throughout. So though it technically has a beginning, but it's saturated with Ein Sof energy, basically. So Ein Sof, what he's saying here is, in other words, it's not just, okay, it continues on, extends and extends, but it's actually this whole entity, like he says, Ein Sof b'chlalusehu Ein Sof. B'chlalusehu b'chinas Ein Sof. Shagam b'schaloshe sheyesh l'tchila, ein b'chinas reish. It's not like it behaves like it has a beginning, even though it has technically a beginning, but that very beginning also is infused with an Ein Sof power. Okay. The difference is in Oyer, it's not through Avodah. The example I gave with Avram is through Avodah, which means Oyer, as soon as God emanated energy, he emanated his Ein Sof power through that energy. So though the Oyer itself has a tchila because it has a source, but it's the energy that it exudes is an infinite energy, not a finite one. And that's why it's called Ein Sof. That's the deeper meaning in Ein Sof. Okay. And here the Rebbe Rashab now adds that this is the meaning of the Eitz Chaim, the famous Eitz Chaim. We read this already, but I'm going over it again. V'zeu shekosav Eitz Chaim lo hoya b'reish v'seif. In the beginning of Eitz Chaim, it says that the beginning, conceptually, Ein Sof filled everything. And there was no Reish v'Seif. The earth did not have a Reish and Seif. It didn't have a beginning and an end. And that's when the Tzimtzum came, it concealed it and allowed for the space of existence to emerge. The space where existence would be created to emerge. But what do you mean it doesn't have a Reish and Seif? We know that earth has a Reish. It begins from Eibers. It has a Tchila. God created it. So he says, it's saying the Lamer. This is what the Eitz Chaim means. Shagam sheshayir beireish v'seif. Of course, it's applicable reish and seif because it has a source. It has the Atzilus is the source of Eir. So it's possible to call that. In other words, it's in the domain of beginning and end because it has a beginning. Nevertheless, so though it does have a source, and that's why you can call it, that's why you can say Ein Sof, because it's in a realm that comes from a world of, it comes from a reality that is higher than it, God, the Tchila, but its very personality is an Ein Sof type of personality. So before it existed, it didn't exist. But once it exists as a full manifestation of God's infinitude, God's infinity. That's what Eir's role is. We talked about this somewhat when I spoke about Eir in a previous volume, I think. What is Eir? That field of energy. You could basically say that God's koyach hagilui, God's power to reveal, God's power to express. This is all Eir. But before Eir begins to assume any particle, so to speak, any definitions like I desire a world or beginning to envision existence, the 10 hidden spheres, Eir itself is like, think of it like a seamless, infinite quilt of divine energy. So it's infinite because it's already manifest, whereas Atzilus you can't even call infinite because God is beyond finite and infinite altogether. So it's infinite in the sense that because it's already, it does have a beginning and it's already a Metzias Nimtza, it exists. However, its personality is an infinite one. It's an infinite manifestation of the divine. There'll be an Eir HaGvul, by the way, which will be a different manifestation where God manifests what he wants to manifest through the revelation of a finite energy. And both of them come from the source. And we'll soon see how Kalim are even deeper than this Ein Sof that we're describing now. But let's not jump there yet. So meanwhile, he's established that the name Ein Sof is applicable only to a place where beginning and end applies. And then you say it has no end. And when you say no end, it's not a small matter. It's fundamentally an infinite state. So in other words, using the example I always give with the artist creates a piece of art. Working our way backwards, we know he can create other pieces of art. He can create infinite pieces of art, but he's not defined by being an artist. He doesn't even have to use art. There's many other things that he has. Eir Ein Sof, what he's referring to here, is everything. Everything God wants to manifest is manifest. Art, not art, infinite piece of art. It's not chesed, infinite chesed. It's not infinite chachma. It's infinite. Every possibility and every possible direction is in this level of Eir Ein Sof. And that's not called Ein Sof lispashtuse. That doesn't mean Ein Sof by extension, which we'll talk about in a moment. That's called Ein Sof, fundamental Ein Sof, what he calls shebechlaluse, shebechlalus bechinas Ein Sof. And that's what the Eitz Chaim means, that Ein Leirosh v'Seif, that's its state. It's a state of Ein Leirosh v'Seif, even though technically it has a beginning, which is God himself, the creator, the source. And now he's going to distinguish, well, let me stop here for a moment because this is a pretty Haskalah piece. You don't find it every day in Chassidus. I'm just even thinking, I don't remember, maybe in Samaches, I think I said this already. I don't remember if I've ever seen this exactly spelled out like this in other Maimar Chassidus. I wouldn't be surprised if not, because Ayin Beis definitely has this expansiveness that the Rebbe Rashab offers, but it could be. Okay, I'll have to look it up. Anyway, any questions on this piece that I just read and explained? Let's begin with that. Okay. So now he's going to distinguish also, which I have not seen in the past. We've talked many times about Atzilus the Pratis, Atzilus the Klolus. That the whole Shtalshlus, the whole cosmic order works in like a hologram. Everything is within everything. There's a microcosm within every macrocosm. There's Atzilus within Bria, there's Bria within Atzilus. And then there's things on, like you say, Atzilus, you have Atzilus in microcosm, and you have Atzilus in macrocosm. So he's going to talk about these two. Atzilus and macrocosm is generally Eir Ein Sof lifnei Tzimtzum. Bria and macrocosm is Adam Kadmon. Yitzira and macrocosm is Akudim and Akudim, or sometimes Atik and Arich. And Asiya in macrocosm is Atzilus Bria Yitzira Asiya in macrocosm. In microcosm, sorry. So in microcosm, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya have a macrocosmic equivalent in a much broader sense. So the Atzilus we usually talk about in microcosm has similar properties to Atzilus, the klolos of macrocosm, lifnei tzimtzum. Obviously, you can't call Atzilus of microcosm before the tzimtzum, but compared to Biyah, that has that comparison. So in a way, even though there's infinite such combinations and repeats, but generally we speak about two of them. So in a way, as we climb the ladder from Asiya to Yetzirah to Bria to Atzilus, then comes a broader ladder where we climb from Asiya macrocosm to Yetzirah macrocosm to Bria macrocosm to Atzilus lifnei tzimtzum macrocosm. Now it takes a little while till you get your head around it, but once you do, you start realizing why so many Maimorim. He suddenly is talking like we're talking about, let's say, Zoh and Malchus, right? The three levels. Biti, Achesi, Imi. First, Malchus is Makabel from Zoh, like a daughter. Then it's equal like a sibling, a sister. Then it becomes like a mother that's Mashpia, Bina. And then we say Bina, Chachma, gaze at Arich and Atik, at the forehead of Arich. And then suddenly we start saying, and that brings down levels of Atzmus Ein Sof, Tainug Atzmi, Lifnei Tzimtzum. So which one is it? The answer is both are happening. That when in microcosm we climb these steps, in macrocosm it's also happening and it's rooted there. Now, obviously, the full-blown experience of before the Tzimtzum is a whole different story than the full-blown experience of Atzilus that's after the Tzimtzum. But there's a commonality between them. That's why Atzilus is called emanation. It's not called Bria, creation. So once you ask the question, obvious question, what do you mean? Everything after the Tzimtzum is Bria. Even Ak is called Bria de Klolos, the macrocosm creation. So for sure, Atzilus, the microcosm is Bria because it's lower than Ak. Because the answer is because God did it in the brilliant way that he took the four higher macrocosmic levels and embedded them in the microcosmic levels. So we can get, just like we said, we can get a taste of Mashiach, the Osed Lavi in Gan Eden. Now, so too, we can get a taste in Atzilus, in microcosm of Atzilus and macrocosm. So essentially, everything is connected to everything. So when we say, B'chol moedecha, with all your heart, with all your spirit, with all your faculties, and also with all your might, with all of you, beyond, ma'od. So that ma'od connects to the highest levels of ma'od, higher and higher. Essentially, a ripple effect. So even though we have an Atzilus within us, and a Bria, and Atzira, and Asiya, each of them have a taste of those higher levels as they are a macrocosmic level. I hope that was clear. So based on that, he's going to say now that this is the difference between Ein Sof Lishpashtuse and Ein Sof B'chlolus. So he says like this: the Zewa Hefresh ben Atzilus Haprotius Latzilus the Klolus. This is the difference between Atzilus and microcosm, Haprotius, the specific, the microcosmic Atzilus, Latzilus the Klolus to the macrocosmic Atzilus. Interesting, he calls this one Haprotius, and this he calls Diklolus. Okay. Shehu b'chinas Ein Sof shalifnei atzimtzum. Atzilus the Klolus, which I just said, is the Ein Sof lifnei atzimtzum. That's why we refer to the 10 hidden spheres, because just like there are 10 revealed spheres in Atzilus of microcosm, there's also 10 hidden spheres in Atzilus of macrocosm. That's a Maseh. That's in the explanation, I think, in the Maimer in Maseh and the Likutei Torah. So that's Ein Sof Lifnei Atzimtzum. What's the difference? The Atzilus, the Proteus, meaning in the microcosmic Atzilus, Hurak She'Ein Sof Lishpashtuse. There you have a taste of Ein Sof, but it's only Ein Sof that extends. Chesed, endless Gvura. V'hainu Sha'od Hu B'chinas Midah V'Gvul. The Eid has measure and parameters and limit. Shubchinis Eid HaChochmeh. In Atzilus, it's Eid HaChochmeh, is the energy of Chochmeh. Chulu, meaning every sphere. Rak she'ein sof lehispashtus HaChochmeh. So why do you call it Ein Sof? Because since it's Atzilus, Chochmeh goes endless. The extension of Chochmeh does not have a limit. But it's still in its own track called Chochmeh. It's not Bina. V'chein bebina, and the same thing with bina and Atzilus. Bina is defined by bina, but bina goes endlessly. So it's Ein Sof only in its extension, like I said before, it's also qualitative, obviously, but it's more quantitative. It's not, but it's still Chachma and Bina. Avla Eid Ein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum, Atzilus the Klolos, but Eid Ein Sof Pre-Tzimtzum, which is the Atzilus, a macrocosm, Hu B'chinas Ein Sof Mamish. That's Mamish Ein Sof. She'ena Begeder Asfiris Klal. You can't even give it any parameter of Sfiris. You can't call it Chachma and Bina. Chachma and Bina is still a parameter. It's just because it's the Eibishter's Chachma, it's infinite. And then there's no beginning and end, and no top and no bottom. He means here not that it doesn't have a source. We know it has a source, a tchila, but its personality is one that's endless on all directions from beginning to end. It's like every part of it is an infinite state of qualitative divine energy. So that's the distinction he makes. This is all going to come back to help us understand how post-Tzimtzum reality can have a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness. But we'll get there. Because right now you see in Ein Sof itself, he's made a distinction between Ein Sof Lispashtuse, by extension, like in Atzilus, the microcosm, and Ein Sof Mamish. And he's still not talked about Atzmus Muhus Ein Sof, which is going to be Ein Letchila, the thing that the real source that doesn't have a beginning altogether. So we'll get there. But meanwhile, he's talking now in the world of Ein Sof itself. The Gam Lefi Mashin is barely ill. I want to give another example, if I may. If you're familiar with mathematics, there's the finite and a set of numbers and the infinite set of numbers. Something you learn right away. You start learning geometry. Now you're told it's all conceptual because there's no such thing as actual infinite, but there's an infinite set of numbers. There's even a symbol for it, like a sideways 8. I don't know if the symbol's still used. I don't know how today's mathematics, but bottom line is, so we know the rule goes like this. The finite set of numbers can never touch the infinite set of numbers. In other words, no matter how many units you add, billions, trillions, zillions, zillions, whatever the numbers are, it never gets closer to infinity. Because the infinite set of numbers, 1 and the greatest finite number are equal. That's the rule in math. So you think this is a real Shalei Berach. One is Ein Sof, essentially infinite, and one is finite. But here's the interesting thing. They have something in common. They're both numbers. They're both a set of numbers. They're not apples. They're not oranges. They're not subatomic particles. They're numbers. So you can, so if you're asked the infinite set of numbers, what do you think about the finite set of numbers? It will say it's very minuscule. They're all equal to me. But it can't say they don't exist because it recognizes the concept of numbers. If you wanted real infinity, a real infinite thing would not even be limited by numbers altogether. In other words, it's not just what the finite is lacking. Even what you are has no value before me. In infinite numbers and finite, what you're lacking is what I'm beyond you because you're lacking the infinite. But what you are, you are. An infinite set of numbers cannot say that one doesn't exist. It could just say one is equal to zillions. But something that's beyond numbers altogether doesn't even find value altogether in the very concept. Even what you are has no value. So what you see from that you could have the concept of Ein Sof and many levels of it. I mean, here I define 2 levels. So in a way, you could say the Ein Sof of Atzilus is infinite chesed, infinite bina, infinite chachma bina. The Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum is no chachma bina altogether. The whole thing is not exist. There's no structure yet. So its infinity is a far broader one where everything is possible. Where in Atzilus, not everything is possible. It's just that chachma can go forever, but not everything is possible. There's no 11th sphere. There's only chachma through malchus. The structure of the art has been created. It's just infinite art. Whereas in Bri, Tzirasi, it's not even infinite. It begins to have true parameters and true limits. Chachma has an end and Bina has an end, as it is in the human being. We don't have infinite, any faculty is not infinite. I just wanted to throw out another perspective. This is an example given by older Chassidim when they explained different expressions of Chassidus when it talks about Ein Sof, and sometimes says Ein Sof b'hashola. In other words, b'hashola, how do you say, Shema Mushal, only a borrowed Ein Sof as actual Ein Sof, and sometimes it's similar to Ein Sof. Like, for example, the Gemara says regarding unfortunately, if a woman loses a husband at sea, he goes out to sea, and he's not found. Is she an aguna, or do you assume that he died at sea? So it says if it was a small pool or river where you could see the banks of the river, then you have to look for him. I'm sorry. I think you assume, no, I'm sorry. You assume that he died. If it's a mayim she'ein lem sof, that's the expression in Gemara. If it's an ocean where you cannot see the banks, it's like goes for miles and miles, like Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, because you don't see the end of it, you could assume he may have made it to the other part of the water. So bottom line is the word mayim she'ein lem sof is used. So the question is, what do you mean? Mayim doesn't have no end. Why do you call it has no end? Because for human relative terms, it's like as if it has no end. It's so large that you cannot see what happened anywhere else. So therefore, you don't know what's going on the other side of the world. There was Atlantic Ocean here in New York is in one place. In London, it's a very place. Pacific Ocean in California, Pacific Ocean in Japan or China. That means Ein Lem Sof. So it's like an Ein Sof, a borrowed term, Ein Sof. It's not pure infinite. You can't call it infinite ocean. There's no such thing as an infinite ocean. But relatively speaking, to a finite body of water, it's called an infinite body of water. This is in other places in Chassidus, they talk about this. I can tell you where, Chassidus Samach Vav, if you want to look it up, and Pasach Eliyahu Tafresh Nun Ches, both from the Rebbe Rashab, earlier years than what we're learning right now. It's just to help a little understand a bit these levels he's talking about. Okay. Any questions? We move pretty quickly to this is like some of the classic Rebbe Rashab's depth of going into these deepest levels of what Ein Sof is, and we haven't even gotten to the ultimate yet. So now he's still going to make a qualification. So he says like this, I'm at the bottom, last line on page 1267. V'gam lefi mashin is barli il. And also based on according to what was explained earlier. B'habiur the shishim heima melochis. So it explained earlier what I would assume means Ayin Beis. In the beer, the Shishim Heim Malachis, I guess in explaining the mimer that explains Shishim Heim Malachis, which is I think he mentioned it earlier. What do we learn? The Gam Kaidem Aleisha Rotzen on page 1268. That also before it arose in his desire, before the Tzimtzum, there's a stage where you say, all over it arose in his desire to create existence. But there's a level kaidem alei saratzin. What do we learn? That even there, shayach sfiris. There they also say that sfiris is possible to have sfiris there. You just told me that Ein Sof, mamish, is a place where there's what he said the words were. Ein beged the sfiris klal. But what about what we learned earlier? That even the finite Tzimtzum, before it arose in his desire, there's a possibility of spheres, shaykh l'spheres, shaykh spheres. Rak shein spheres ain't cats. Only they're infinite spheres. In Atzilus, microcosm, there are only 10 spheres, and each one of them extends infinitely. But before the Tzimtzum, he says, you just said there's no spheres, and now you say there's spheres. Those spheres are infinite, not 10, but infinite amount of spheres. So the Rebbe Rashab is qualifying, how does it reconcile with what he just said, that there's no spheres altogether? It's complete Ein Sof. Not only infinite spheres, no spheres altogether. Because spheres are still some expression. So he answers, he says, we already learned earlier, Dibra Masvela Yechel Yosef Lis Apek. We learned in the Maimer, this is a volume 1 actually. This is a Maimer, a very fundamental Maimer about the 3 levels of Keser. Back in volume 1, he says at page 240. Ubekama duchtin. The acronym is either bekama duchtin, kama drushin. It's the same idea. In Aramaic, duchtin means drushim, many essays or many discourses. Discourse is the right word. that we learned this. What did we learn? The Pirish Ein Ketz, who Shasfiris Atzmam Hem B'chinas Ein Sof. When we say Sfiris Ein Ketz, you could say it means not 10 spheres, but infinite spheres, or you could say Ein Ketz, and that the spheres themselves are a level of Ein Sof. So he's like basically squeezing in another level now. Because the general like I said before, is qualitatively infinite. So therefore, in these spheres, there are also infinite in that way. So it's not as in infinite spheres where you have 10 spheres, infinite spheres, and then you have Ein Sof Mamish. He says the spheres themselves are really qualitatively Ein Sof, like the is. That's what how he's interpreting it. So let me explain why is he splitting a hair here? Why is it so relevant? I'll tell you why. Needs a little explanation. Remember, in the interface, one of the big challenges, finite and infinite. Everything in existence is finite, right? That's the whole question on the table now. That even with Simcha Shal Mitzvah and even with Tainug Atzmi, B'chol Meidecha, Mesiras Nefesh, we still are dealing with some structure. You can't completely eliminate structure. The whole existence is based on structure. You can expand the structure. It can become a keli for that which is beyond structure that we've been learning. But a big part of this discussion is how do you bridge the finite and the infinite? Because finite, as I said before, as far as you go, you never will hit infinite. And yet there's a bridge between the two. So one of the ways Chassidus tries to make understandable, and this is an important point that I want to make, some things are always going to remain that you have to say God wanted it to be that way. But in Chassidus, we never rely and say God can do anything he wants. Because if that's the case, you can eliminate this whole discussion altogether. God can create a world without stepping stones, without Seder Shtalshelus, without Tzimtzum, without Oyer, without all the levels, as I said many times. But he wanted to make it make sense to us based on our terms. And yet there are going to be points where we're going to say only God could do this. So Chassidus says you only reserve that when you've left no stone unturned, and you've explained everything else. So sometimes you come to a point and say, okay, finally, God is the one that made that happen. But after that, and everywhere possible, we want it to make sense. I remember when I started learning Chassidus and started coming to these themes and ideas, I came to ask myself the question. I said, you know what? At the end, they start telling you anyway you can't understand completely. Because no one can see God. Atzilus is built in Metzias Nimtzum. Or it's like you learn Gemara all day, and then you find out whatever you know, some scholar that lived or is living knows everything you know, and as far as you're going to go, you're never even going to get close to what he knows. So it can be very disconcerting and say, hey, I made all this journey, and I come to the end of the marathon, and I find out, hey, you know what? There's some people who've been here a long time, and I'll never reach anywhere where they reach. But then you come to understand a very critical point in Chassidus. Chassidus is not a marathon, and it's not a race. It's not a contest. It's about you experiencing God on your terms. It makes no difference what anyone else does. So whatever you can do to internalize godliness is a tremendous impact. It's not you say, okay, I internalized, and someone else who learned a lot more Chassidus than me will always know more than I do. That's not how it works. That's in a world of competition with fragile egos where we are comparing ourselves to others. In a godly world, it makes no difference what anyone else does. It's completely you. And therefore, if you worked hard in understanding one piece of a mimer and you internalize it, that's you've changed worlds. That's what the Rambam says. One action, one good word, one good thought can tip the scales. Why do you say, what do you mean? What's one? I know another person who's done 1,000 mitzvahs. What's my one mitzvah compared to 1,000,000 mitzvahs of a tzaddik or of all the generations? But it doesn't work that way. We're not dealing, God doesn't work in numbers. It's not a numbers game.
It's like they say, like,
hold on. One second. Let me finish and save your question. So one second.
Not a question, okay.
Okay, but so the point being is that the whole point is internalizing a lakus in our systems, every person in their way. So therefore, when we learn these levels, and then you discover that there's areas you'll say, one second, you need God anyway. What's the point that I understand it? When you understand something that God created, you have now experienced godliness in your seichel, in your very being. Every fiber of your existence is permeated with it. That's the goal. So this is all an introduction to share the following, to say what I wanted to say in this whole context. So why is it so relevant? Because the more you can create stepping stones where finite and infinite meet, the easier it is for them to meet. So there's the finite Bri Yitzir Asiya. It connects with Atzilus because Atzilus is true. It's Ein Sof Lispashtuse, but it has Chachma Bina Das and Chesed Gvur Teferes, and that is a common denominator with Bri Yitzir Asiya, because we also have Chachma Bina Das. But now you move from a Chachma Bina Das that's finite to a Chachma Bina Das that's infinite. From the Chachma Bina Das that's infinite, you move to a state that's higher than Chachma Bina Das, Spheres. But the Spheres are like to go back to the artist. From one piece of art, finite art, you move to an infinite piece of art. From an infinite piece of art, you move to a place that's higher than all the and has all infinite possibilities of art, not just one that extends infinitely. And from there, you move to levels that are even higher than art altogether. So the Rebbe Rashabas breaks it down, first the finite, and then the infinite, like an Atzilus microcosm that extends infinitely. And then from there to infinite that spheres Ein Ketz, unlimited spheres. And then unlimited spheres really means Ein Sof. It's not just unlimited spheres, unlimited pieces of art, but it's actually fundamentally in an Ein Sof state, like we said, like Ein Sof, not in any way as a sphere. The spheres are simply just a part of the Ein Sof, the quilt, like I said, the infinite divine, the infinite field of divine energy. And then from there, we're going to move even higher. So you have yourself now stepping stones in finite to infinite and in infinite itself levels that make us easier to understand. It's easier to go from Chachma, our Chachma, finite, to God's Chachma, which is infinite in Atzilus, and so on in the higher levels. So this is not just semantics here. He's actually explaining these higher levels of infinity as we go. And that's why, as he qualified and said, even though before Elisa Rutzen, there's spheres Ein Ketz, says Ein Ketz could also mean, it says, we learned earlier, Ein Ketz is not just unlimited spheres, but qualitatively it's a state of Ein Sof, like Klolos Erev B'chinas Ein Sof. That's, we are on the third line. I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything or questions. Okay. Now comes, let's see.
Rabbi Jacobson, the difference with Atzilus, we said about the qualitative difference between or Ein Sof, and the or. One is shaykh to have the beginning, and one has an intrinsic aspect that is qualitatively different than the or that's in this world, found in this world. The or Ein Sof written at Simpson, or Bria de Cloud, I think it's the Atzilus de Clouds, right? You said there it's a unique, it's a different kind of or. I was wondering if Bria de Clouds, which is Ak, also has that level of that unique level, which is, we made a differentiation between the two types of or, one that has at its essence.
No, because Bria is a creation, and a creation immediately means it's finite.
So
Ein Sof only applies to Atzilus the Klolos and Atzilus the Pratis. Bria, once you say Bria means Yesh Ma'ayin, and Yesh Ma'ayin is already a finite entity.
So this aspect of or Ein Sof, Litnei Tzimtzum, Atzilus the Clouds, but we still speak about Esespheres of the Nuzos there. So I was wondering, how does that relate?
I just explained, we're not talking, Esespheres Hagnuzis is a lower level, and secondly, the Esespheres Hagnuzis, the Rebbe Rashab explained at length, are not actual spheres, they're just for us to be able to talk about God envisioning. And now he just addressed it. He just said that the levels, even the levels, it depends what level you're talking about. So, first of all, we're talking about Ein Sof in general. We're not talking about the Esespheres Hagnuzis. We're talking about Ein Sof in general, which is higher than spheres altogether. Like he said, there's no spheres altogether. And even where it says there's spheres saying Ketz, he just explained, those are also means, really, it's Ein Sof fundamentally. Essence spheres agnuzis is a lower level in Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. We're not discussing that right now.
Thank you. That's
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So now the parentheses, which is not so, a parentheses around how many lines? 3, 6, 7, around 10 lines. No less. 1, 3, 6, 7 lines. So here's the parentheses now. And according to this, that in general, the infinite divine light pre-Tzimtzum, shaykh le'meshu b'seif kamei b'haschala. Ma'acha she'en b'chinas reish v'seif. It's possible to say, or capable of saying, that at the end, it's like in the beginning that it has no beginning and end. Being that it's fundamentally a state of Ein Sof, so though, yes, it came from the creator, so it has a source, but the way it's created, it was like we said, I'm just wondering why he says these words. Before he said B'aschala kamei b'sof. Okay, I guess he means to say that the whole thing is one qualitative, so-called bundle of Ein Sof, if I can put it that way. I don't think the word bundle is not really the right word, but basically the whole thing is one big field of Ein Sof. Well, the illness bar, let's see where he's going with this. And earlier we learned, was explained, the Ein Sof hablikvul gamkin shaykh ma'ilo mata, b'ma'ilo sa'ir. That in the infinite divine light, the blikvul, you can also speak about a hierarchy in the quality of air, that there's something higher and lower. I believe he's referring to the Maimer, Lo Yochel Yesef Li Sapik. I'm almost sure that's the Maimer, that's where it says that. And he's sending us to the Maimer Vayiglu Hanorim in volume 2. 1 second. Okay. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember what it says there. So seemingly there's a contradiction here. Because earlier we learned that in Bligvul there's also some type of levels. Here he says clearly the Aschol is like the Sof, which means Shubasof Kamei Ba'aschala, that it's all like one infinite soup of divine energy. So what does he mean here? So why do we say that? So he says, Ach b'zeh yesh hefresh. He's qualifying. However, in this matter, there's a difference between etzem ha'er li'spashtus ha'er. Okay. You're going to distinguish between the core energy and extension of the energy. The bispashtus ha'er, in the extension of the energy of the air, and the way it comes and transmitted after the tzimtzum, liyaz b'b'chinas seva v'makif. There it comes in the form of seva v'makif, because it's erab likvul. So how does erab likvul manifest itself? In a makif dika way, in a transcendent way. It doesn't enter in permeate internally each level like mamala kalalmin, like pnimi. It's a makif. So bligvul in higher levels, as it manifests, in its pashtus, how does it extend? It extends in a transcendent way. It surrounds. Surround here, the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, it doesn't mean physically surround. It means it's not revealed internally. It remains hovering, it remains transcendent and above. That's makif. This pasuk says, Hagam she'ein hatzimtzum oiseh davar be'etzem ha'oir. So even though the tzimtzum doesn't affect the very energy, so the energy retains its bligvul property. That's why it doesn't enter internally. It always remains a type of hovering, a transcendent energy. But nevertheless, you can, because it's an extension of the er habligvul, not the etzem of the er habligvul, you can talk about it in terms of higher and lower. You could say keser of Atzilus, keser of Bria, keser of Yetzira, keser of Bina, of Zah, even though keser is a makif. So though it's a makif, you have different makifim. You see levels in makifim. In other words, in this Pashtus Sa'er, there are levels of makif. The makif of Atzilus, the makif of higher. There are many ksarim, many igulim, it's called, many spheres. So all of them, it says, Kol ksarim nishtalshlim zemezeh. All these crowns or these transcendent energies are all connected, but still, you can talk to them, relatively speaking, the transcendent energy of Atzilus is higher level than the transcendent energy of Bria, though they have their own track that leads them back to Er HaBligvul. That's in this Pashtus Sa'er. When we talk about the core energy, if you talk about the real essential essence of this energy, not as Pashtus, not as it extends in the Shtalshalos and downward, but it's with the atzmi, a core energy. Ayin Beis b'seif klal. It doesn't have any beginning or end. They're all no levels. For who b'seif kamei b'aschala. And it's exactly the same at the end as it is in the beginning, a total equalizer. Where there, that level would be equal in all the worlds. Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya would have one. The etzema the makif of, or the habligvul of the etzema Ein Sof would be a complete equalizer. So essentially, we have pnimi, which is different. Chachma is different than bina, even though their two could both be Ein Sof. Then you have a makif of chachma and bina, where the makif is different, and then you have a makif, like he says here, or atzmi habligvul Ein Sof mamish, which equalizes chachma and bina. Even the keser, even the transcendence, are all equalized under that one central etzema So in Ein Sof itself, so in Ein Sof itself, we have now Ein Sof this Pashtus in Atzilus. You have Ein Sof mamish in Lifnei Tzimtzum in Lifnei Tzimtzum Atzilus the Klolus, and there too you have his Pashtus that can be connected, relates somewhat to structure, but it still remains above it, and a level that's completely beyond structure, completely beyond, complete seamless, with the complete equalizer, complete infinite seamlessness. And the level of Spheris Ein Ketz, he says, belongs to the level, well, you could say now both levels. You could say Spheris Ein Ketz could be the level of Ein Sof where there's differences, but he says here Spheris Ein Ketz, there's no differences. That's what it looks like. Close Ein Sof. Or you could also interpret it two ways. Fine. Yeah. And I'll pause again because of the density here, the depth. And then if not, I'll continue. I'll try to finish till the end of the paragraph. Any questions, thoughts?
Yeah, Rabbi, when the bleed bull, you said result is manifested in or maki, so that doesn't enter into panini. So my question is, how it seems like a contradiction. If it's truly bleed bull, it should be able to enter into my panini. It's bull it remains in a maki solve level rather than entering into all levels. But have the bull.
Bligvul is always, where did you ever see that Bligvul enters into Pnimi? Bligvul, by definition, means outside of structure.
But I realize that, but when you were teaching it, to me, a question jumped up, which is, that it does have a gvul, and that its gvul it remains only in a maki. It doesn't. The gvul is the panemius remains outside of its domain, so to speak, and it doesn't permeate that. That would seem to be a gvul in itself.
So what? So be it. So fine. Bli gvul has a limitation that it's only bli gvul and not gvul. Correct. That's a correct statement.
Okay.
The statement that the Eibishter, about the Eibishter, it says, if you said he only has the power to create bli gvul and not gvul, that's a limitation. For bli gvul, that's all it needs. Its role is to be bli gvul. Its role is not to be gvul.
So it does have an intrinsic.
Yeah, but that's what's meant to be. That's why it's called bli gvul. Infinite is not meant to be finite.
Could you say that it's could you say that it's out of structure, but it's everywhere present?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
That it's out of structure, but everywhere present.
That's the definition of makif. That's the definition of makif.
Right. So I mean, just take
that says in Tanya.
that.
That's not what he's. That's a statement. That you're trying to explain something here in Ayin Beis. That's Tanya. Tanya says that. It's all present.
I'm just trying to say, could that be a definition of bli gvul of a bli gvul?
Which one? Which bli gvul are we talking about now? You're talking about
the bli gvul, the bli gvul of makif.
Which one? Hispashtus ha'er or etzem ha'er?
Well, hispashtus for sure.
Well,
but
the
it's
difference
everywhere
is
present.
hispashtus ha'er means that though it's in the still realm of bli gvul and makif, it recognizes the differences between Atzilus and Bria. That's the key.
Right.
Whereas the etzem ha'er does not recognize because it's completely beyond it all. That's the key difference.
Good.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, Rabbi?
Yeah, sure.
And this is, as you know, very deep and esoteric, so this may be a stupid question. But are you saying that or bli gvul cannot permeate in a panemiistic way? It has to be or hagvul that is a panemi in bia? Or you're not saying
meant to. It's not by the could or can't. It's not meant to.
Okay.
That's not its role.
I get it. So your answer is yes. Its characteristic is that it's makif. It's not panemi.
Yeah, its personality is meant to represent the God's infinity, not the defined energy as it goes into each creation, which is specific to that creation.
I got it.
Like
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah, this is heavy duty stuff, and I'll tell you the truth. When you read it, I'm seeing it. I see how this is now connecting the whole Ayin Beis. I'm not just seeing this as some footnote here. This is fundamentally what he wants to explain ultimately in the real interface of things, and he's taking it right to these highest levels to explain it. But it's not over yet. We haven't even gotten to Kalim. This is all So, Vihine, should I read? Let me try to read till the end of the paragraph, unless it gets too difficult. Vihine, and now Kfar Nizbar Le'il was already explained earlier. But just for the record, all of this whole piece, literally we're going back we're on 1262, 1268. We're going back now over 1,000 pages. Rebbe Rashab is referring to subject matters that he spoke about 1,000 pages back in the middle of volume 1, which is critical in the whole theme, where he talks about the 3 meanings of spheres. I'll just refresh your memory if you want me to refresh it, or you can look it up yourself. Spheres have 3 meanings. I'm talking about immanent energy, pnimi. It means number, sipur, story, narrative, and sapir, transparent energy. Because the spheres, the immanent energy, pnimi, has 3 levels. How it tells how it's a number, so it's just the external structure, the narrative within that structure, and the transparency within that narrative, which connects it to God's story that you find in the art of existence. Then he leads and says the same thing exists 3 levels in transcendent energy, in makif, in bli gvul, in keser. The 3 meanings of keser that go back to the first page of Ayin Beis in the beginning of the whole Hemshech begins with the three interpretations in Keser. So he's literally not saying those words, he's talking about these levels now. And the three levels of transcendence also have similar three dimensions. Like every interface needs three. One is Keser, Arich, as it communicates and speaks to the Netzalim, to the immanent energy, like the Rotzen, the Arich. There's Primius Arich, then there's Atik, or Atik and Primius Atik, three levels in Keser, where they're all Bligvul now, and they're all Makif and Seviv, but one that relates to the structure, one that hovers above it and is not relating to it, but it's not completely beyond, and one that's completely beyond. Here he's not referring necessarily to all three, even though I think he is, and we'll soon see how. But right now he's really talking about these levels. But this all goes back to these themes that he discussed all the way back in volume 1. And that is obviously critical piece in understanding the whole Hemshech. And I think what's happening here is the Rebbe Rashab is bringing it all together now in context of how do we actually reach levels that are beyond structure, even with Simcha Shal Mitzvah and even with Neshamas and everything, the question that is presenting and ultimately going to explain how Einoid, Kalim, have something that reveals something that even Oyer, even as high as levels of Ein Sof don't reveal, which is the Ein Tchila of Atzmus. But we'll get to that. So let me see. I was going to read the next few lines. So he says like this. The reason I just, all this is coming to me because I see he's already said twice, Hine Kfar Nizboil Ill. Whenever the Rebbe Rashab repeats that, that means he is essentially telling us that he's bringing these ideas that he discussed earlier into it. And since he said it twice, which is not so common, you look for all these telltale signs of little hints that tell you. And the fact that he's also bringing the Maimorim from back then. See, the second line, Kfar Nizboil Ill, and now again, Hine Kfar Nizboil Ill, which means clearly he's referring to what he wants us to remember what was said earlier. So he says, Hine Kfar Nizboil Ill, which he just said in the parentheses, which makes me think that he wrote the parentheses after he wrote this line. Just a thought, because he's saying it as if he didn't say it yet. So Ein Sof, yes, etzem, core, and ispashtus extension. In general, extension of the Eid is aliyas haratzon, because God is already now saying, it arose in my desire to create an existence. That means he's already associating. You don't have existence, but in the creator, in the Eid Ein Sof, you already have now a relationship. I'm arising in my will to create existence. He says that's Ispashtus Eir B'chlal, Sha'ola B'ritzeinei HaPoshet L'Haitzil, that arose in his seamless desire, seamless, to L'Haitzil, to emanate, Atzilus. The Etzem who kaidem alei sharatzon, and Etzem before precedes the desire, like he said on top of the page, where he said there's still spheres there, but there's spheres saying ketz. V'hu b'Eid Ein Sof, Eir hameir la'atzmei v'Eir hashayach l'zulos. What are these two levels in Eid Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum? The Eir that radiates to himself. There's an expression Eir meir la'atzmei, and there's Eir meir l'zulosei, Eir hashayach l'zulos. I'm sorry. And the Eir that is already allocating or beginning to associate with another. The difference between when you're thinking an idea just to yourself, but then you're thinking how you're going to communicate it to someone else. It's all within you still. It's all in your thought. But one is a thought completely to yourself, and one is a thought that's to another. There are higher levels too, which I don't want to go into right now, where there's not even thought altogether. There's no consciousness altogether. So here goes again. He tells us to go to Ma'aleshcha Gimel, which is where? In volume 2. Yeah, that I do remember that piece. Okay. Ubeprotius, and when you break it down further, B'chinas Etzem Ha'er is B'chinas Hahelem Shalamaylam B'chinas Gili, Gam La'atzmei. Here's even a higher level. When you break it down, the Etzem Ha'er, till now he said the Etzem Ha'er is like the Gili to yourself, which is before he arose in his desire. Now he says Etzem Ha'er is the Helem that's even higher than the Gili to himself. You're not even aware of it yourself. Awareness itself is a descent, as we've learned. Even by the Abe, he doesn't need to be aware of something to know it, for it to be there. So here's a state that's higher than Gili Gam La'atzmei, V'hu Inyan Hu Ushmoi, and that's the level of Hu Ushmoi, him and his Hu Ushmoi Bulvad. So Shmoi is this level, Etzem Ha'er. It's not Atzmus, but it's one with him because it's not even subject to Gili altogether. As was, here goes another, again, he's referring us earlier. And look, Commissioner Bez was explaining the Dibra Maskal now, which I assume means Bahaleska, or maybe it's one of the other Memorim, I'm not sure. And that's like the potential, the core potential power. Hiyuli means something that's not even a, koyach and poyel can be have the power to throw a stone and then I throw the stone. That's not hiyuli. That means your faculty and you're actualizing your faculty. Hiyuli means something that's like in the core essence, the potential for it. So he calls this the hiyuli ha'atzmi. There's a hiyuli and there's a hiyuli ha'atzmi. That's what he's referring to this level of hu shmoi etzem ha'er, according to this deeper, the specific explanation, that's higher than gili altogether. V'zehu, he's bringing it back to the v'zehu d'sheirish hakelim hu ma'atzmus u'mahus ein sof baruch hu. He's bringing it back to the beginning of the subject. And that's the root of the containers is not just from Ein Sof, from Atzmus U'Mahus Ein Sof, if you recall, from the core essence of Ein Sof, but of a Sheder She'eres from B'chinas Ispashta Sa'ed. So he's explaining it this way. The root of the containers is Etzem Ha'er, what he called here, Koydem Alei Saratzen, or even before there's any Gilui altogether. Or in the parentheses, Etzem Ha'er, that is a total equalizer because there's no distinctions at all. And the Sheder Sha'eres is Ispashta Sa'er. Not Etzem Ha'er, Ispashta Sa'er, where there is a relationship, it's a makiv, but it's still a relationship to levels, it could be to levels, and it's Alei Saratzen, where there's already some type of connection to existence, even though it may be distant, but it's there. So that's the distinction between, okay, so he went back and said, Ein Sof, you can only say on not on Atzmus. But Atzmus U'Machus Ein Sof is Etzem Ha'er, which is higher than Ispashtus Ha'er. So we have and Atzilus, which is Ein Sof L'Ispashtus, it's Chochma Bina, but it goes infinitely. You have Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, that's fundamentally Ein Sof qualitatively, without any distinction between spheres. And now you have Atzmus U'Mahus Ein Sof, Etzem Ha'er, that's completely beyond it all. That's even a deeper level. Mm-hmm.
Is he also saying that the shorish of...
One minute. Just a moment. Anybody raised for safe is what? Atzilus the Klolus. Yeah, you have to say that Kalim is even higher than the highest level of Ein Sof, where there is no distinction at all. It needs still some explanation in different ways. He's explaining Ein Sof, but clearly Kalim goes all the way to the highest level. The next level is Ein Sof is Pashta Sa'er. I'm just wondering about Etzem Ha'er. Is there Etzem Ha'er that's lower than the root of the Kalim?
My question goes to that. Can I ask my question or no?
1 minute. Okay, what's your question?
My question is, he's saying that the shorish of the kelim is mamish the koach hayuli ha'atzmi, meaning to say that before there can be or, there has to be the potential for or, but in order for there to be a potential for or, there has to be a potential for kelim. You can't have or without keli. What's the purpose of the or? So he's saying that the shor.
It's not what he's saying. It's not what he's saying. It's not what he's saying at all. But where do you get what you just said? Is where do you see that in these words here?
Well, the shorish hakelim.
What he's saying is very straightforward. He says that there's two levels. There's Ein Sof, like he said, and there's Atzilus Muhus Ein Sof. So Etzem and Hispashtus Er. Hispashtus Er is the root of the Eris, where they're already relating. There's revelation, and the root of the Kalim is from a place that's higher than revelation. Etzem Er, as he put it. That's what he says right here. Okay. So you have a question on that?
Maybe, but we're both thinking through. I'm going to sit back for this. I think we may have to come back to this. I'll just sit back until it gets fleshed out more.
I have a question on that. That's what he said. V'zehu the shorish hakelim hu ma'atzmis muhus ein sof, and doesn't say or ein sof. Is that not telling that it's not in the realm of any level of or that we've talked about?
Well, first of all, one second. The fact that he says v'zehu, there's a v'zehu, there's a flow. So he just finished telling us about the difference between etzem ha'er and hispashtus ha'er, and then he says zehu sheresh hakel ma'atzmus Ein Sof baruch hu v'sheresh b'chinas hispashtus ha'er. So it seems, even if he doesn't say the word er, it means that he's talking about three levels. Etz atzmus Ein Sof baruch hu, etzem ha'er and hispashtus ha'er. So etzem ha'er belongs to which realm? Or or kelim. So that's the first thing that seems to, even though he doesn't use the word er. Or it is possible that he's talking about the etzem ha'er relates to atzmus Ein Sof baruch hu because it's not er. It's not revealed. It's just called etzem ha'er. But I would reserve any final interpretation of this until we continue reading, because he's going to speak more about it. He's going to speak va'inyan hu now. So I'm guessing, which I think is a good guess, that he's going to refer to this again, and we'll try to get to the bottom of it. Right now, he did speak about etzem ha'er hispashtus ha'er, and he said, and then said v'zehu. So that's where I'm taking my cue from. Now it's true he doesn't say the word atzmus muhus ein sof, but I'm not sure if that is something we can really be medayik in or not. That I'm not positive.
Is he saying here whether the shorish of the or?
Because in the beginning of the paragraph, one second, the 5 lines on top and the beginning of paragraph on the previous page, 1267, he also said sherish hakelim. He said sherish makar b'shem b'chinas kelim b'chinas atzmus muhus ein sof baruch hu, and then he says sherish makar eres hu b'chinas ein sof bilvad. So we have to understand what he means by ein sof and atzmus muhus ein sof baruch hu. So I would reserve, because most likely he means etzem ha'er, not etzem higher than etzem ha'er. Now etzem ha'er itself, you can say, connects more to atzmus muhus ein sof than does hispashtus ha'er. But as I said, I'd rather reserve any final statements on this when we learn inside. I also don't want to bring what I know from other Maimorim. This is a subject that I'm very familiar with, because this is discussed in many Maimorei Chassidus, and at length. So I'm very deliberately not bringing any of that into this picture. I'm learning it like we're all learning it together without any prior knowledge. So I don't want to bring that in because I'm not sure what level the Rebbe Rashab. You could learn this a few ways, pshat, and I don't want to confuse matters before I see which direction he's going.
Is he saying that the Shorsh of Kalim is higher than the Shorsh of Or?
That he says right in the beginning of last paragraph. Look at the beginning of the paragraph on page 1267. Sheirish Kalim Kodum L'Sheirish Ha'eris. It's explicit. It's not even, he says it explicitly.
Okay.
Okay. So we'll stop here by the end of this paragraph on page 1268. Any other questions? Anybody else want to bring something into this?
Rabbi Jacobson, I have a comment. I'm not sure if I'm on the right track on this or not, but the whole Hamshech started with Naaseh and Ishma at the whole Matan Torah experience. And as we all know, it says that they saw what they were supposed to hear and they heard what they were supposed to see. Is that this kind of a level that we're reaching now that actually people experience at that point? Number one question. And number two, in Purim, which is Simcha with the mitzvah, it says that you're supposed to get to a level that you do not know the difference between, Haman the Rasha and Mordechai the Tzaddik. So is this also the level that we're referring to, like the
My initial response would be, well, first question, for sure not. Because in the beginning of Ayin Beis, there's a whole section, a whole chapter, where he talks about hearing the sounds, hearing the sights and seeing the sounds as the level of the 10 hidden spheres. The 10 hidden spheres is clearly lower level than what we're talking about here, because here he's talking about higher than spheres. So that's number one. As far as the second, it depends on which Maimorim. As you know, I always respond to you pretty similarly. The connections to other places, unless the Rebbe Rasha makes it himself, is speculation. Because you could always say that in the Purim, Maimorim talks about something may not be exactly this level. So I am very careful before making such a statement. Is it possible that it's connected to these levels? Yes, it's possible. I'm not positive. I know that with the Matan Torah that you mentioned, for sure, he talks about the 10 hidden spheres. That I know in the beginning of Ayin Beis. With Purim, depends. It could be many different levels where Purim reaches. In the Avil of Vushma, in the Maimorim of the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, on this topic, he does talk about Purim somewhat where the Kalim are higher than the Eiris. So there may be some commonality there. I'm going back now. I'm literally referring you. If you want to look up, first of all, the Matan Torah thing with the sounds and the sights, that is, if you want that is I think it's chapter 19. Going back to page 30. That's the sounds and sights. Regarding Purim, the only thing that comes to mind is the Sheirish HaKelim. He does talk about it, even earlier in Ayin Beis. I'll tell you where it is. End of the first mimer even? Oh no, end of the second mimer. Yeah, I think there it is. Very early on, he talks about this topic. So maybe there's something about on page 18, chapter 11, where he talks that Nasa Kodim Lanishma is Bitla No, I'm not sure. It could be he talks about the Kalim and Eres there, but that's the most I can really say because I don't know until we really finish the subject what we can connect it with what we can't, and what exactly is which level.
Thank you so much for the references.
Yeah. Okay, so we're stopping here at the end of the paragraph.